Margaret Lawson had always been known in her small town as a woman of quiet dignity. At 60 years old, her face bore the lines of a life lived with both sacrifice and endurance. Her gray hair was tied neatly into a bun. Her posture still carried traces of the strength she had once relied upon, and her eyes, though soft, held within them the shadows of old battles and silent victories. She had not lived an easy life, nor had she been handed comfort by fate. She had clawed her way toward stability, brick by brick, penny by penny, all while raising 2 children who she believed would one day return her love with love of their own. Her husband, Richard, had died nearly 15 years ago. The memory was still fresh, like a scar that had healed but still ached in cold weather. He had been her companion through the long storms of early marriage, when money was scarce and meals were meager, and yet they had laughed through much of it. Together, they built dreams, and together, they sacrificed their own pleasures so their children could have better chances. When Richard's heart gave out one spring morning, Margaret had stood by his grave with her children at her side, silently promising him that she would take care of the family, no matter how heavy the burden. True to her word, she never remarried, never sought companionship outside her children, and never complained when loneliness knocked at her door. Instead, she worked relentlessly, managing the modest rental properties Richard had left behind, investing cautiously, and growing the inheritance with patience. She became, quietly, a wealthy woman. Not extravagantly wealthy like those who flaunt their riches, but secure enough to own several homes, a healthy bank account, and investments that could support her well into old age. But wealth, Margaret discovered, was both a blessing and a curse. While it shielded her from the fear of poverty, it also created an invisible wall between her and her children. Claire, her daughter, grew to see her not as a mother, but as a source of favors, funding, and financial rescues. Daniel, her son, though more subtle, also leaned on her generosity. There were always reasons: student loans, business ventures, car troubles, housing needs, and Margaret, with her soft heart, rarely said no. She told herself that helping them was what mothers did. That sacrifice did not end simply because children grew up. Yet in the quiet of her evenings, when the clock ticked loudly in the silence of her empty living room, doubts gnawed at her. She remembered birthdays when neither Claire nor Daniel came unless there was a gift involved, holidays when their visits were short, rushed, and filled with conversations about what they needed rather than what they could share. The laughter she longed for, the stories of their lives she hoped to hear, rarely came. And when they did, they were accompanied by requests, subtle or direct, that reminded her of the unspoken condition behind their affection. The ache of realization began to grow inside her. Margaret started to wonder if her children saw her as anything more than a bank with a beating heart. The thought tormented her. A mother's greatest fear, she knew, was not death, but the knowledge that her love had not been truly received, that the years of sacrifice had raised not gratitude, but dependence. She could not shake the fear that when her wealth was gone, or when she was too frail to give, it would reveal the truth about their loyalty. It was during a particularly cold winter evening, as snow blanketed the streets and the fire in her living room flickered weakly, that the idea struck her. Margaret sat in her armchair, a knitted shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, her hands resting on her lap. The shadows danced across the walls, and in the solitude of that room, she whispered to herself, "If love is bought, then it isn't love at all." The words lingered in the air, heavy, almost sacred. For the first time, she considered the possibility of testing her children, not with money, not with gifts, but with absence, with the illusion of poverty. She wondered what would happen if they believed she had nothing left to give. Would they still visit her? Would they call her simply to ask about her health, to share a moment of laughter, to bring her comfort in her old age? Or would the silence grow thicker, the distance wider, revealing the loyalty they claimed but perhaps never truly possessed? The thought terrified her, but it also ignited something fierce within her, a mixture of sorrow, courage, and the quiet revenge of a woman who had given too much without receiving enough. She decided then and there that she would do it. She would let the world, including her children, believe she was broke. The following days were filled with careful preparation. Margaret was meticulous. She stopped wearing the elegant clothes she usually favored, replacing them with plain dresses that looked worn. She stopped inviting her neighbors for tea with fancy pastries, instead offering simple biscuits. She even let her garden grow a little wild, no longer paying the gardener to keep it immaculate. When neighbors asked, she sighed and mentioned vaguely that times were hard, that some of her investments had collapsed. The rumor spread like wildfire, as rumors in small towns often do. Soon, it was no secret that Margaret Lawson, once comfortable, was now struggling. Her heart trembled as she waited for her children's reactions. Claire's phone calls, once frequent though, often self-serving, dwindled almost immediately. Instead of asking how she was, Claire seemed more concerned with confirming the gossip. Daniel, too, became distant, his once cheerful visits replaced by excuses about work and stress. They both began to look at her differently. Though Margaret could see it only through their silences, it was as though her worth in their eyes had diminished the moment her supposed fortune disappeared. And in those quiet moments of realization, Margaret's heart cracked. She spent long nights staring at the ceiling, replaying their childhoods in her mind, how she had worked double shifts to pay for Claire's piano lessons, how she had gone without new clothes for years so Daniel could attend a private school, how she had stayed awake countless nights nursing them through fevers and heartbreaks. She remembered Richard's voice, firm yet loving, telling her, "Family is everything, Maggie." She had believed it with all her being. But now, as the icy wind rattled her windows, she began to doubt if family had believed the same about her. Her days became a strange performance, a play in which she acted the part of a woman brought low by misfortune. It pained her to walk through the grocery store and hear whispers of pity. It pained her even more to see her children's fading presence in her life. Yet, beneath the sorrow, another emotion grew: anger. Not the wild, raging anger of youth, but the quiet, sharp anger of a woman betrayed. It sat heavy in her chest, fueling her resolve. Margaret realized that this test was not just about her children's loyalty. It was about her own freedom. For years, she had lived under the illusion that money tied her family together. Now, by pretending to lose it, she had peeled back the illusion and seen the truth. It hurt, but it also gave her clarity. She knew she could no longer live as the woman who endlessly gave and silently wept. She had to become someone stronger, someone who chose her dignity over her children's conditional affection. In the silence of that winter, as the snow continued to fall and her fireplace burned low, Margaret made a silent vow. She would see this test through to the end. No matter how painful, no matter how lonely, she would not turn back. If her children failed, then they would not inherit her wealth. Instead, she would leave it to those who truly knew the meaning of loyalty. Strangers, perhaps, but strangers who had not pretended to love her only for what she could provide. And so, Margaret Lawson, at 60 years old, stepped into the most daring chapter of her life. She wore the mask of poverty, not out of desperation, but out of defiance. She would not beg for love. She would not buy it. She would let the truth rise, no matter how devastating it proved to be. The weeks following Margaret Lawson's decision passed slowly, as though time itself had grown heavy with the weight of her secret. She had committed herself to the role she had chosen, the disguise of a woman undone by financial ruin. It was a strange performance, one that demanded a kind of strength she had not expected. She had lived honestly her entire life, priding herself on being straightforward, on carrying herself with dignity, but now she found herself speaking half-truths, watching the flicker of suspicion in others' eyes, and crafting the illusion that she had lost everything. She wore this new identity like a coat that didn't quite fit, stiff on her shoulders and suffocating in the chest. Yet she pressed on because she believed the truth she sought lay at the end of this act. Her first test came with Claire. Her daughter had once been the bright, laughing girl who had filled the house with chatter as a child. Margaret remembered her skipping down the staircase, asking endless questions about the world, hugging her tightly before bedtime with promises that she would always love her mother more than anything. Those memories felt almost cruel now when compared to the woman Claire had become. When Margaret first hinted to Claire on the phone that her finances had collapsed, there was a pause, a silence that carried with it not concern, but calculation. "Oh, Mom," Claire had said after that silence, her voice thin and oddly rehearsed. "That must be really hard for you. But, you've lived comfortably for so long. Maybe it's time to cut back, adjust to a simpler life." Margaret had closed her eyes while holding the receiver, steadying her voice so it wouldn't tremble. "Yes," she replied softly, "simpler life." But in her heart, she had felt the words land like a blade. Not once had Claire asked if she was all right, if she needed support, or even if she wanted company. The conversation quickly shifted toward Claire's own troubles, the rising costs of her household, her children's school expenses, her desire for a new car. Margaret listened, nodding quietly even though Claire could not see, realizing with every word that her daughter was already distancing herself. Daniel's reaction was different, but no less painful. When Margaret shared her story of supposed financial ruin with him over tea, he had frowned deeply, his hands tightening around his cup. For a moment, she thought perhaps his heart would rise above the circumstances. But then he sighed, leaned back, and muttered, "I can't believe you didn't tell us sooner. You should have been smarter with your money, Mom. Now you're going to have to be careful. I don't think I can help much. I have enough on my plate as it is." Margaret had smiled faintly, masking the shiver that ran through her. "Of course, darling. I wouldn't want to burden you." He patted her hand absent-mindedly, but his eyes had already drifted toward his phone, as though the matter had been settled. It was then that Margaret began to truly feel the depth of her loneliness. The loyalty she had once assumed was unshakable seemed to vanish the moment her wealth disappeared. She waited for calls that never came, for visits that dwindled to nothing more than perfunctory appearances. When they did appear, her children came carrying not love, but impatience. Claire's greetings were curt, her eyes scanning the modest meals Margaret offered as though silently judging them. Daniel often complained about his own life, his work stress, his financial burdens, but rarely turned the conversation back toward his mother. The house grew quieter than ever before. Margaret spent evenings in her armchair, knitting scarves she no longer had anyone to give to, staring out the window at the snow-covered streets where children played freely. She remembered when her own children had once run laughing down that same street, their cheeks flushed with the cold, calling out to her to watch them build snowmen. She remembered wrapping them in blankets, serving them hot chocolate, their small hands clutching the mugs like treasures. Those memories pressed down on her chest until she felt she could barely breathe. But grief was not the only feeling that grew in her heart. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, anger began to take root. Not the wild, explosive anger that faded as quickly as it came, but the deep, smoldering anger of betrayal. It settled in her bones, sharp and bitter, reminding her with every silence, with every absence, that her children's love had been conditional. She had built her life around them, sacrificed her youth and her dreams, worked tirelessly to ensure their comfort. She had given them opportunities she herself had never known. And in return, now that she supposedly had nothing to offer, they had given her nothing but distance. Her neighbors noticed the change too. Mrs. Turner, an elderly widow who lived across the street, dropped by occasionally with homemade pies. "You've lost weight, Margaret," she said gently one afternoon. "Are you eating properly?" Margaret smiled and assured her she was fine, but her heart ached. Here was a woman who owed her nothing, offering kindness, while her own children barely bothered to check in. The irony was not lost on her. As the days stretched into months, the mask of poverty became heavier, almost unbearable. There were moments when Margaret wanted to tear it off, to scream the truth at her children, to demand why they had abandoned her so quickly, but she held back. The test had to run its course. Only by enduring it fully would she have the clarity to make her final decision. Her loneliness grew into a physical presence in the house. At night, when she climbed the staircase to her bedroom, the echo of her footsteps reminded her of how empty it had become. She would pause sometimes in the doorway of Claire's old room, still painted in soft lavender. With stuffed animals sitting quietly on the bed, she would run her fingers across the bookshelf filled with children's stories she had once read aloud. Then she would stand in Daniel's room, the shelves lined with trophies from his school days, and remember his wide smile when he first held them. Those rooms felt like memorials now, not to lives lost, but to a kind of love that had once existed, but no longer seemed real. There were nights when Margaret wept silently into her pillow, her body shaking with the grief of it. She thought of Richard often, wishing he were there to share the burden. In her mind, she imagined what he would say if he knew. She could almost hear his steady voice. "Maggie, you gave them everything. If they cannot love you without money, then their love was never yours to begin with." She clung to those imagined words like a lifeline, though they did little to ease the ache. Her health began to falter under the strain. She grew weaker, her body tired, her sleep restless. Yet she forced herself onward, knowing she had not yet reached the point of resolution. The mask of poverty still served its purpose, revealing more truths with each passing day. Claire stopped visiting entirely. Her calls became rare, brief, filled with excuses. Daniel still came occasionally, but his visits were perfunctory, his eyes always elsewhere, his words always tinged with impatience. One evening, after Daniel had left abruptly following a short and uncomfortable visit, Margaret sat by the fire, her hands trembling around a cup of tea. The anger that had been simmering within her rose to the surface, sharp and undeniable. She whispered into the empty room, "You've both failed me. You've failed the test, and you don't even know it." It was in that moment that her sorrow transformed into resolve. If her children had shown her loyalty, she would have gladly left them everything she owned. But now, having seen their true colors, she knew what she must do. Her wealth would not go to those who saw her only as a purse. Instead, it would go to those who understood loyalty, kindness, and compassion, qualities her children had abandoned. Though the months had been filled with heartbreak, Margaret realized she had gained something precious: clarity. The mask of poverty had stripped away illusions and exposed the truth. It had left her bruised, but it had also given her the strength to make the hardest choice of her life. And so, Margaret prepared herself for the final act, the revelation that would not only expose her children's betrayal, but also secure her dignity once and for all. The test was almost over. Soon, they would sit across from her, expecting money, pity, or perhaps forgiveness. And soon, they would discover that their failure had cost them everything. The invitation went out quietly, handwritten in Margaret Lawson's elegant cursive, the same script she had once used to write birthday cards to her children when they were little. The ink trembled slightly under her hand, not from hesitation, but from the weakness of her age. She asked both Claire and Daniel to join her for dinner on a Saturday evening. There was no occasion listed, no explanation given. Just the simple request of a mother to see her children. She half expected them to ignore it, as they had ignored so many of her needs over the past months, but to her surprise, they agreed. Perhaps, she thought, curiosity had drawn them in, or perhaps they feared she would burden them with another tale of hardship. Either way, it did not matter. She had already decided how the evening would end, and nothing could dissuade her. For days, she prepared for the dinner with deliberate care. Unlike the plain meals she had offered them recently, this one would be a feast. She had her housekeeper, whom she had quietly kept all along under the pretense of friend helping out polish the silverware and bring out the finest china. The dining room table gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, draped with a white cloth, the scent of roasted lamb, buttered vegetables, and spiced wine filling the air. It was a setting of wealth, of comfort, of all the things Margaret had hidden away for months. She wanted her children to see, to know, to understand, not only what she still possessed, but what they had lost. On the evening of the dinner, Margaret dressed with deliberate grace. She wore a dark green velvet gown that Richard had once loved, her silver hair pinned neatly with a jeweled clasp. She looked in the mirror for a long time, studying the lines of her face, the softness of her aging eyes, and whispered to her reflection, "Tonight is not about weakness. Tonight is about truth." She felt a surge of strength, quiet but undeniable, flow through her. When Claire and Daniel arrived, their surprise was evident. Claire stepped inside first, her eyes darting immediately to the table. "Mom," she said slowly, I thought you couldn't afford." She cut herself off, her voice tinged with suspicion. Daniel followed, his brow furrowed, his gaze sweeping the room as though trying to solve a puzzle. Margaret smiled warmly, though the smile never reached her eyes. "Sit down, both of you. It's been far too long since we've had dinner together." Her voice carried a firmness that neither of them dared to challenge. The meal began with small talk, awkward and forced. Claire commented on her children's schooling, her voice sharp with pride but hollow in warmth. Daniel spoke of work, of stress, of the endless frustrations of his life. Neither asked about their mother's health, her days, her loneliness. Margaret listened in silence, nodding occasionally, her mind drifting between memories of their childhood and the harsh reality of their present selves. As the evening went on, the unease grew. Both Claire and Daniel seemed restless, exchanging glances that betrayed their confusion. Finally, Daniel leaned forward, his voice cautious. "Mom, what's going on? I mean, this," he gestured at the table, the food, the elegance of the night. "This doesn't look like someone who's broke." Margaret set down her glass of wine and folded her hands in her lap. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, but now that it was here, the weight of it pressed against her chest. She drew in a steady breath, her eyes fixed on them, her voice calm yet sharp. "I am not broke. I never was." And the words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Claire's eyes widened, her face pale. Daniel blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. Margaret continued before they could speak. "I wanted to know," she said, her tone unwavering, "whether your love for me was real, whether it was tied to me, your mother, or tied to what I could give you. So I let the world believe I had lost everything. I let you believe it too. And in those months, I saw the truth. I saw how quickly you both pulled away, how little you cared for me when there was nothing left to take." Claire's face twisted, her voice sharp with defense. "That's not fair, Mom. You lied to us. How were we supposed to react? We have our own lives, our own responsibilities." Responsibilities. Margaret cut her off, her voice rising for the first time. "I raised you both with nothing but sacrifice. I went without so you could have everything. I worked through sickness, through grief, through loneliness to make sure you never suffered. And when I pretended to lose it all, when I needed love more than ever, you gave me excuses. You gave me silence. You gave me nothing. Daniel's face flushed red. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, Margaret said, her voice trembling now, not from weakness, but from the force of her emotion. Every phone call that never came, every visit cut short, every cold word, every absence, they told me what I needed to know. The room fell silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the hearth. Margaret reached beside her and lifted 2 envelopes, placing them gently on the table. Her hands did not shake this time. These, she said, sliding the envelopes toward them, contain the truth of my will. I want you both to open them. With hesitant hands, Claire tore hers open, her eyes scanning the words quickly, her lips parted in shock, her breath catching. Daniel followed, his brow furrowed deeper with every line he read. Inside each envelope was not money, not inheritance, but a letter explaining that Margaret had rewritten her will. Every property, every account, every piece of her wealth would go not to them, but to charities for the elderly, shelters for the abandoned, and scholarships for children with no families. You can't be serious, Claire whispered, her voice then almost breaking. All of it? To strangers? Not strangers? Margaret corrected softly. To those who understand loyalty, to those who will not turn their backs when love has nothing to give them but presence. You both had your chance. You both failed the test. Daniel slammed his hand on the table, his face twisted in anger. This is insane, Mom! After everything we've done for you. Margaret's eyes burned as she cut him off. Everything you've done for me? Tell me, Daniel, what have you done besides take, besides ask, besides treat me as if my worth was measured in money? Tell me one thing you've done out of love alone. His mouth opened, but no words came. The silence was answer enough. Claire's eyes brimmed with tears, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of loss, of greed slipping through her fingers. You're punishing us, she said bitterly. You're taking revenge. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her voice steady, her eyes glistening. No, my children, I am freeing myself. For too long, I believed my love for you was enough to make you love me back. But now I see the truth. My love was unconditional. Yours was not. And I will not reward betrayal with fortune. The words struck them harder than any blow. They sat in stunned silence, the envelopes still in their hands, their futures rewritten before their eyes. Finally, Claire pushed back her chair, her face pale with rage. You'll regret this, she spat before storming out. Daniel followed, muttering curses under his breath, slamming the door behind him. The house fell silent once more. Margaret sat at the table, her heart pounding, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had done it. The weight she had carried for months, the sorrow of betrayal, the anger of abandonment, it had all poured out tonight. And though the silence that followed was sharp, it was also freeing. She felt broken, yes, but also unshackled. For the first time in years, she had chosen herself. She rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window, watching the snow drift softly under the streetlights. The world outside was quiet, untouched, pure. Behind her, the table stood as a testament to the night. The feast uneaten, the envelopes opened, the truth revealed. She thought of Richard, imagining his voice once more, telling her she had done the right thing. She smiled faintly through her tears. Her children had failed the loyalty test, but Margaret had passed her own. She had chosen dignity over illusion, truth over comfort, freedom over fear. And though the road ahead would be lonelier, it would also be honest. For Margaret Lawson, that was enough.